Hello everyone. Welcome to another wonderful webinar here at EHN Canada. My name is Jonathan, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar on guilt, shame, and self-compassion. For those of you who are long-standing attendees of our webinars, welcome back. And for those of you who are new to EHN Canada, we are a leading nationwide network of treatment centers from addiction, trauma, and mental health. We offer inpatient services with centers coast to coast, as well as intensive outpatient and virtual options. For more information, feel free to visit our website at ehncanada.com. Everyone is on mute and cameras are turned off for today's webinar, but we'd like for you to use the Q&A box to submit your questions for our speaker throughout the session. I'll be personally keeping track of all the questions. Sometimes the Q&A box doesn't work. Feel free to drop it in the chat as well if that's the case, and I promise I will get to it. We will be sending a follow-up email in the next week that will contain a link to the recording of today's session and, of course, your CEU certificate. To stay updated on our future webinars and newsletters, we invite you to opt into our mailing list by filling out the form that will be linked in the Q&A chat. We're located in Toronto, which is on the traditional territory of several nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. If you're new to this work and want to find out whose land you are on or grew up on, please visit www.native-land.ca. And now allow me to introduce you to today's speaker. Antoline Tiruchelvam is a registered psychotherapist practicing for approximately 13 years in the province of Ontario. She is certified in CBT, Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, CPT, Neuro Rehabilitation, as well as CSAT certified. She is training in IFS, DBT, and somatic experiences. She has dedicated her career to understanding the inner workings of a human and has taken a holistic approach to creating change in clients. She has been with EHN Canada for approximately 4.5 years and is currently a clinical manager of our substance use disorder program for outpatients. Now, without further ado, pleased to welcome Antoline.
Hi, everyone. So thanks for that introduction, Jonathan. And thank you for joining me today as we talk about guilt, shame, and the power of self-compassion. Okay, let me just get my bearings here. So we're going to first start with understanding 3 different components that is really, I think, are very vital, and that is the healthy guilt versus the unhealthy guilt and shame. And let's begin by first discussing healthy guilt. What's the difference between healthy guilt and unhealthy guilt? Because I find that most individuals don't have a clear view, and they tend to mistake unhealthy guilt as healthy guilt. So what is healthy guilt? Healthy guilt is an emotional response when one does something that is objectively wrong. So we all have these standards, right? And what happens when we do something wrong? So like, for example, I'm at home and I've had a really rough day at work, and I come home and I, for no reason, yell at my husband, poor husband, right? And I start maybe saying a whole bunch of really bad words, or and I'm really mean to him. We know that I know that he didn't do anything wrong, and yet I responded in that way because of my own stressors that I'm experiencing. So I recognize that I've done something wrong and I'm feeling bad about it, right? That's healthy for me to feel bad about it. And so then I make these steps to ensure that I'm rectifying the relationship. So I would go back and I'd be like, hey, I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to yell at you. I didn't mean to say all these bad things. I'm really having a really rough day at work. Hey, how about we do something? What can I do to make this better? Right? So that is, I know I've done something that is objectively wrong. And it encourages me, this type of guilt encourages me to make amends with whoever I wronged, so that I can maintain a healthy relationship. It builds new behaviors, right? It builds us as a human being, and we get a really good, strong inner compass. Guilt in general, healthy or unhealthy, it starts developing. It's not something that we're born with. It actually starts developing at around 3 to 5 years of age. Okay. And then there's unhealthy guilt, right? Unhealthy guilt is an emotional response when one does something that goes against our irrational high standards, right? We have, like, think about perfectionists, if you're aware, right? Think about people who are very rigid personality, have this need for control and have difficulty with flexibility. Those individuals tend to have this irrational high standard, and they're plagued by this unhealthy guilt. And as a result, this unhealthy guilt forces us to take on responsibility for things that are really not in our control. And as a result, because we take on this responsibility, then we emphasize self-punishment. So we're taking on the responsibility, we're very critical of what has happened, and as a result, we're beating ourselves down, because we haven't met that standard, right? For example, there was this young lady in the treatment facility that I was working, and I was doing this group, and she was talking about how she felt so guilty, right, for the death of her sister. She wasn't there for her sister's death. There's nothing really she could have done. There was, like, it just happened, and she took on that guilt and held on to that guilt for many, many years, because she was taking on that responsibility for something that she was not even responsible for. And as a result, we have a hard time forgiving ourselves for any mistakes that we have done, right? So, like, let's say I called, I forgot somebody's name, right? And then I know this person. I do this all the time, by the way. I forget people's name all the time. But let's say I'm at a meeting, and I'm looking at someone that I've worked with for years, and I basically say, and I'm like looking at them, and I'm like, "What is your name?" Right? And because I forgot their name, now I'm feeling guilty, and I'm feeling like, what kind of person am I? Right? So we're unable to forgive ourselves. I'm able to forgive myself because I forgot somebody's name. But that happens, right? That's normal, right? Um, and unhealthy guilt, again, guilt in general develops as around 3 to 5 years of age. And these irrational high standards were developed early in childhood. So think about, let's say, a 3-year-old, right? Like 3-year-olds, they can't sit still. I have a 4-year-old. Sorry, he's 5 and he can't sit still at the dinner table. He's bouncing around, looking at things or whatever. And so think about that child, right? Let's say he's at the dinner table or she's at the dinner table, and the whole concept around spilt milk. They're moving around, and all of a sudden they knock over their cup, and the milk spills everywhere. What is this response that our caregivers are giving us, right? It could be something like, "What did you do? Why did you spill that milk?" And as a result, if this is happening on a regular basis, what the internalizing message that this child is receiving is, I need to not spill anything. Because if I spill anything, then I'm doing something wrong. I am wrong, right? And this is not the behavior is wrong, but it's I am wrong, because the response is, what's wrong with you, instead of you spilled the milk, right? So it develops early in childhood. Shame is the consequence of unhealthy guilt. So continuous episodes in our life, right, that makes us feel guilty for things that are not our fault, that we have no control over, leads us to believe that there is something internally wrong with us, right? Believing and feeling fundamentally wrong. So or flawed. So instead of believing that we made a mistake, we now believe that we are the mistake, right? And as a result, we have these feelings, these painful feelings of being worthless and inherently defective. Like, think about that. Like, how awful, right? How painful someone has to feel in order to feel worthless and inherently defective. And the crazy thing about shame is that it can develop as young as 15 months. 15 months. And there's some researchers that would even say earlier than that. And most of the time, the question that I get when I say this is, sorry, the question that I typically get is, how can a 15-year-old or 15-month-old able to experience shame? Well, think about it. Here is a baby, right, that is reaching out, maybe out of the crib or reaching out for attention, right? Maybe they're crying profusely, right? And the parent is not willing or able to pick up the child. Now, if this happens once in a while, it's not going to be a big deal. But if this is the consistent experience of the child, then the experience internally for the child is, I'm not good enough, right? So 15 months old. And we have to also look at it as what's happening in the brain, right? When at 15 months. So when we're born, right, our ability, our cognitive ability to rationalize and analyze information is not there. It's not, hasn't been developed. It's not going to start developing maybe until around like 7 years of age. And it doesn't stop developing till we're like 25 years old, right? So think about that. So as a result, that the part of our brain that is now really involved in understanding the environment is actually emotion. Like, that's basically it, right? So when we're feeling in distress and we're reaching out for comfort as a baby, and we're not receiving that comfort, then the feeling that we get is rejection. Now I'm labeling these feelings, but I'm labeling them so that you can experience what it would feel like for the child, right? This baby. So it reminds me of this story about this kid, this baby, in like this foster home. And it was like this nunnery, right? So in this nunnery, they had all these babies up for adoption, and there was this child that was at night put to bed, and the nuns went off to go to sleep. And the next morning, the nun came in to pick up the child, and the child's ears were all chewed up, and they never heard a peep from this kid this whole night. No peep from that kid. And what they found out was a rat got into the kid's crib and chewed the ear. The child never made any noise because the child learned at a very young age, this baby learned at a very young age, that if I scream, nobody's going to come to get me. So this is how it's developed. Nobody cares about me. Nobody loves me. I'm on my own. So why bother screaming? Right? And as a result, it leads us to fear rejection and abandonment. We're constantly fearful of that, or believe that we are rejectable and people will leave us. Right? And as a result of this fear, it forces us to disconnect. We stop connecting with people. We stop creating relationships, maybe, or our relationships are really not so good. And we avoid anything that makes us feel the shame, right? So, like I said, shame is the fear of disconnect. All human beings have this need to want to connect. That is the fundamental, I believe anyway, the fundamental deep core need for all human beings is to be connected. And when this connection is somehow severed in some way, then it leads us to shame, right? And when we have that shame, we're consistently fearing of the disconnect and we'll do whatever it takes to not feel that. So that could mean that we're getting into relationships that are not good for us, right? We're getting into maybe we're in an abusive relationship, right? Or unhealthy, some form of unhealthy relationship, because we're constantly wanting that relationship. Or it can go in the total opposite, saying, I don't need anybody, right? I don't want to be connected to anyone. It's a way to protect us and keep us safe from feeling that shame. So there are 5 components of shame. The first component is external evaluative component. So that means we're constantly looking around and evaluating how others see us, right? That's the first component. The second component is an internal evaluate component. So essentially that means we're judging ourselves. We're evaluating who we are as a person, right? There's something wrong with me. And then there's the emotional component. And I think this is a really interesting component, in that shame doesn't show up as the emotion of shame. Shame actually shows up as various different emotions. I've met people who are angry, or an angry person, but the anger is not really that they're angry, an angry person. The anger is just their shame, like they're feeling threatened and they're retaliating, right? Their sense of self is being threatened, and so they're retaliating. Or anxiety, like we think about social anxiety, fear of being in social situations. The fear of social situation is simply shame of being found out of who I really am, and then eventually being rejected, right? So we need to be, as therapists anyway, we need to be really open to the idea of, well, what is this emotion really about? And most times what I find is, especially working with individuals in mental health and addictions, is that their emotion and their reactions and behaviors in the forefront is just a symptom of that shame, that when we dig deeper. Then there's the behavioral component. So the behavioral component is that avoidance or retaliation, like I said with anger. An example of this that I've seen in inpatient facility is, for example, when a new client comes into treatment and they're complaining about every little thing in the building, right? That nothing that has any value, they would complain about. They complain about their room, they complain about the roommate, whatever it is. When we dig on that, right, that is a behavioral component. When we dig around what is the meaning behind that behavior, we see that it's actually avoidance of not feeling that shame, right? They don't have their substance of choice available to them, and so they're responding to that shame. And then finally, there's a physiological component of shame, which I'm going to get into, because I think this is also a very interesting component. So the physiological component is that shame is actually related to the stress response, or it is the stress response. It is related to the fight or flight response. So let me get into that a little bit to give some context. So in a normal, sorry, not a normal, but in an average individual who has not been, who gone through trauma in their life or had some negative adversive experiences in their life, the way they respond to stressors or a threat in the environment is way different from how someone has developed this intense shame, like the perfectionist, or someone who has gone through trauma or anything like that. So for individuals who have not, who have like a very healthy way of relating to the threats in their environment, essentially what happens is the amygdala, right, the part of the brain that is related to that emotional fight or flight response, is triggered. It picks up this the event, the threat in the environment much quicker. I think they say around like 5 microseconds or something like that, faster than the prefrontal cortex. So that picks up the environmental cue, which essentially triggers a set of responses that leads the prefrontal cortex to shut down, right? So this part of the brain, and it tells it to shut down because I don't need to think right now. I need to respond to the threat. A bear walks into your room, right? You're not going to think about, what am I going to do? You're going to be like, get out, right? Fight or flight. I'm going to fight this bear if I can't run away, or I'm going to get the hell out of here, right? So we're not thinking about it. But what happens in an individual with a healthy way of relating to threat is that the prefrontal cortex is still, monitoring the amygdala. It's still connected to a very small degree connected, because when there is the threat has been removed, what happens is the prefrontal cortex recognizes that and is able to kind of work with the amygdala to kind of say, okay, the threat's gone, we can calm down and we can go about our day. However, for someone who has gone through trauma or have this intense shame to particular stimuluses in the environment, what's going to happen is when that trigger appears, it's going to create that emotional response to the fight or flight. But the ability for the prefrontal cortex to assess the situation and recognize that the danger is over is not present, right? So what does that mean? It means that we cannot, any trigger in the environment that is even 10% familiar or resembles similarity, 10% similarity to the original traumatic event or original experience, will lead to this fight or flight response. And we can't get out of it because we're stuck in it, right? So we have this irrational, that unhealthy guilt we talked about, shame. This is shame, right? That fight or flight response, this is shame, and we're stuck in it. We're unable to think everything's okay, that I'm going to be okay, that I'm not that bad person. That is gone, right? So in order to kind of like help the connection to return, we have to stimulate the prefrontal cortex. So that means the CBT, the DBT, all that stuff. We're working on stimulating the prefrontal cortex to assess the trigger, the emotion, and get better. And that's what we do with self-compassion, right? Self-compassion stimulates the prefrontal cortex, but it stimulates two different ways. The top-down approach, which is analyze, like, I'm good enough, I'm a good person, I'm worthy, to help change the emotional response. And self-compassion actually can work from bottom up. So from the emotion, working towards changing the way we think about the situation. So I'm feeling this intense feeling. I'm bringing curiosity into it. I'm practicing changing the feeling, thereby changing the way we think about the trigger and our response to it, thereby feeling safe again. Okay, so that's what's happening in a biological level. I'm not a biologist in any way. I'm not like a professional in this field. I'm a psychotherapist, but this is the basics of what's happening in the brain. So this leads us to self-compassion. So according to Buddha, Buddha says that you yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection. So you yourself, and this is the problem with many people, right? I'm also one of those individuals, right, that kind of struggles with that, is that I myself have a hard time believing I deserve love. And that is everyone, right? But the reality is we all deserve love. We deserve as much as anybody else. But we look for other people, we help other people, we take care of other people, and we put ourselves aside in order to ensure that everybody else is okay. But self-compassion is also taking care of ourselves. So let's look at it a little bit deeper. So according to Paul Gilbert, he talks about the emotional system. In a healthy individual, this system is quite balanced. So let me talk about the different parts of it. So the threat system is our fight or flight response, right? So it helps us to keep us safe. It's important, right? The threat system is not a bad thing. It's just when we get when we go through trauma or when we have PTSD, this threat system is overactive, right? It works really hard to keep us safe, even when we're already safe, right? That's an overactive threat system. Then the drive system is our motivation. It focuses on goals, like it motivates us to achieve, to find a house or find roof over our heads, food to eat, to keep us safe, to keep us alive, right? But then we can also have an overactive drive system. And this overactive drive system and also with the threat system is it's related to that shame. Okay. And then soothing system is reduces distress by providing self-compassion, right? So it helps us to stay calm. It helps us to feel I'm okay. It helps us to feel essentially safe. Now, in an individual who has gone through trauma and who has maybe interactions with their their caregiver as a child, the soothing system, what ends up happening is it becomes underdeveloped. So what that means is as an adult, we're simply relying mainly on the threat system and the drive system to balance our emotions, right? So when we are triggered from the environment, we can have this very loud reaction to the environment, or we can have even the opposite, which is a no reaction, very blank type of reaction, right? And with self-compassion, what we're learning to do is start building the soothe system so that we can now start creating a more balanced emotional system. So I talked about the self-compassion, like how it can go top down or bottom up. And in this figure here, we see that the drive system and threat system when we have an undeveloped soothing system, the drive system and threat system are working essentially with each other, right? So when there's failure, the failure creates a threat, and so we practice self punishment, right? And back and forth. So the failure is what. So when we do make a mistake, we feel we have failed, and it's a threat to who we are. So we feel shame, right? This is the same as the brain slide that I showed earlier. Okay. So there are three components of self-compassion, but this was developed by Kristen Neff. So there's self-kindness versus self-judgment, right? As human beings, we judge. We can't get out of that, right? We judge when we wake up in the morning and we look outside and we judge how the day is going to be, what clothes I'm going to wear because it's warm today, so I'm going to wear maybe a t-shirt, or if it's too cold, I'm going to wear a jacket. But what we also do is we judge ourselves, and we do a really good job at judging ourselves, right? So part of self-compassion is how do we bring in self-kindness? And I'll talk to you about that in a little bit. And then another part of self-compassion is common humanity versus isolation. When we're stuck in shame, we feel so alone. We feel nobody else in this whole entire world is experiencing what we are feeling. And as a result, it creates a lot of pain, right? But we want to shift that mindset to understand that there are many people who are struggling exactly the same way, or maybe even similar to what I'm struggling. I'm not alone. As I've said here, I've met many people, and I'm also one of those individuals who, sometimes I judge myself. Sometimes there are many individuals, friends that I have, family I have, that I see that very normal individuals who are constantly critical of ourselves, of themselves. So part of me having to work through that is I'm not alone in this. Others are struggling just the way I am. And that is the message that we want to tell ourselves when we're practicing self-compassion. And then the other component is mindfulness versus over-identification, right? We want to be very mindful of the emotion that is happening with ourselves without over-identifying with ourselves. So what does that look like? What does this whole thing look like? So over-identification is, let's say I'm sad, right? Over identifying means if I'm sad, I'm going to look at every single component of my life that is going to fuel the sadness. Okay, that is not self-compassion. That is self-punishment. When I'm sad and I ask myself, well, why am I sad? What is this feeling? Where is it coming from? That's being mindful. So we want to shift our attention and our understanding to away from that critical voice, away from over-identifying with the emotion, to being more curious about what is happening with us. So self-compassion is not um, these words that you tell yourself, although some people, they do and it works for them. But what I also found is that individuals who are suffering, who have these personalities of like the perfectionist personalities, who have this high standards of living that they will never meet, right? Or others will never meet. The Just simply telling yourself you're worthy or okay is not enough. You can't. No matter how many times you tell yourself this, it's not going to go anywhere. So we need to start from a very basic place. And that is just simply even having the intention of looking within, right? If we can even have the intention. So one of the exercise that I sometimes do with individuals is whatever they're feeling, whatever's coming up in the moment, I ask them to reflect back into um, the the feeling. What is it? What are you feeling right now? What are you experiencing in your body? Right? What is what does that experience or feeling want to tell you? So getting away from in here into in here, because this is what we do when we're self-critical. What I find is that most people are in here analyzing and assessing every single situation and not feeling and understanding from in here, right? So when we practice self-compassion, it is actually being able to sit with the discomfort and working through them. Now, sometimes that's hard on our own. That's when therapists come in, right? When therapists ask questions to bring in curiosity to oneself, that is self-compassion, right? And sometimes you will struggle with bringing that curiosity, and and that's when the therapist has to be that part of you that is self-compassionate in that asking those questions to bring in curiosity a little bit at a time, right? So until you're able to bring in curiosity yourself. that, like, I really do think that's why that's one of the main reasons why therapy works, is because we're working on bringing, somebody's helping you bring in that curiosity to oneself. When we bring in curiosity, when we become mindful and being present, learning to be present in the moment, we then bring in self-compassion and our ability to start healing the shame, healing the belief that I'm not good enough. And then when we heal, then we realize we are normal, we're okay. So I'm going to end this presentation with a little story about the chameleon and the giant. So the chameleon was this person who didn't like herself. She was, she hated every part of herself, right? She had this poor sense of self, um, and thought she amounted to nothing. The giant, on the other hand, was seen as this big, strong, confident person. And Chameleon was like even wondering, how did I ever get a guy like the giant? Chameleon and Giant were this married couple, right? So Chameleon did everything for the giant, and whatever Giant wanted, Chameleon did, and that was it. And that's where she found, I guess, fulfillment, because she didn't want to do anything for herself. She was not worth anything. But one day, Chameleon's like, I want a child. And she goes and tells the giant, and asks the giant, hey, I really want a child. The giant was like, I don't know. I really don't want to, I don't know if I want to have a giant. Because if they have a giant, then all the attention will be off of him and onto the child, right? But in fear of losing Chameleon, Giant agrees, and they end up having a child. They have this girl named, and they named her Perfect. And Chameleon, from the day she was born, decided, I'm going to make sure she gets everything she deserves and wants and needs to ensure that she never turns out to be like me. So she gave everything to Perfect. But when Perfect started crying, Chameleon laughed it off. Ha ha ha, what are you crying about? I give you everything, right? And pushed her to be this perfect person. Meanwhile, Giant started isolating himself, right? He started just spending more time on his own. And Chameleon, thinking this is what Giant wants, said, okay, we're going to leave Giant. We're not going to spend any time with Giant. Giant wants to be by himself. And Perfect is like craving this relationship with her father, right? And she reaches, she wants to have this relationship. So she's like, okay, you know what? I'm gonna make him a horse. She knew that Giant loved horses. So she whittled day and night on a piece of wood and turned it into a horse. When she thought it was perfect enough, she gave this horse to the giant. The giant looked at the horse and was like, what is this? It's not my birthday. Take it away, and gave it back to Perfect. So Perfect grew up with these expectations from mom and a lack of relationship from Giant. No matter what she did was not okay with to have a relationship with Giant. And mom expected so much of her and wasn't allowed to be herself. But one day, Perfect decides to, Perfect makes a mistake. She makes a mistake, and oh my goodness, she's filled with so much shame, right? She hates, oh my God, I can't believe I did this. And so she runs off. She runs off into the woods, and she runs and she runs and she runs. My parents are going to hate me. Nobody's going to love me. And she runs, and eventually she's in the woods. She stops and she's crying in the woods. And, and as she's crying in the woods, humankind notices her and walks over and is like, why are you crying? And Perfect tells humankind this entire story. And then humankind looks at her and is like, okay, come with me. Humankind takes her to the River of Clarity, where Perfect looks at herself. When she finally sees herself, she realizes she's not a giant, she's not a chameleon. she's just perfect. She's just human. When she realizes that she's just human, all that shame and all that feelings of pain that she had left, went away. So the moral of the story is essentially that when we are able to look at ourselves with clarity and understand the imperfections and the perfections are what makes us human, that it's all good. And that's when we can let go of our shame, and that we can do that with self-compassion. And that's my presentation.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Angeline, for that fabulous presentation. And I love that story at the end too. That was really, really great. Look at all the hearts and applause. We love to see that. Thanks so much for listening, everybody. We do have some Q&A coming in. So happy to be here and go through that. Appreciate the hand up, Patty, but yes, please feel free to add your questions in either the Q&A box or the chat box, and we'll try to get to as much as possible. So our first question comes from Rosemary. Their question is, my clients are often worried that when they strengthen their soothe, self-compassion system, they will lose their drive system, for example, motivation, push, goal achievement, etc. Can you help me to better explore or explain this concern with clients? It's a great one.
Sure. So if they strengthen their soothe system, they're feeling like their drive system is going to go down. So there's a difference between perfectionism, right, being perfect, and simply trying to achieve excellence, right? When we have perfectionism and we move towards the direction of where we want to go, when we make mistakes or don't do it the way we like it to do it, then we're feeling really awful about who we are. But when we're able to activate the soothe system to in the time when we're in the when we make that mistake or whatever it is, or we're not meeting that expectation, the soothe system calms the part of us that feels bad, right? That feels that pain, so that we can then realign ourselves and move toward in the direction of our final goal. So it's actually drive system and soothe system are working together. When soothe system is activated, it doesn't stop the drive system. It works together. So we're moving in towards that our goal without, I guess, the pain, if that makes sense.
That's great. Thanks so much, Angeline. Our next question comes from Christine, who asks, can you share some strategies for reframing habitual self-criticism as a way to increase likelihood of improved self-compassion?
So with any type of self-critical talk, it's not about simply transforming the self-talk to a more positive self-talk. I mean, that is part of it. That's using our frontal lobe and working through that. But it's also being able to understand where is it coming from, right? So when we have that negative self-talk, we need to explore the shame or the resistance for change before we can actually create the change. So the steps that I would take is actually explore the resistance. Like if this person is having a hard time implementing the positive self-talk, why? Why are they having a hard time implementing the positive self-talk? What is stopping them?
That's great. Thank you so much, Angeline. I have a couple questions myself that sort of popped up for me that I was really curious about. So, how do you build? So we have guilt, we have shame, and part of this, like one of the things that came up to me was this whole idea of experiencing rejection. I was wondering, how do we build up rejection sensitivity, or maybe a lot, or like to work against that for people who are struggling with it in the workplace, or maybe in a relationship even?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there are many different factors with respect to that, but what I would suggest with anything is um, to build up resiliency towards rejection is to be confident with ourselves and to know that that rejection is not an interpretation of who you are as a person, because that's what happens, right? When we're rejected, we're interpreting it as there's something wrong with me, right? So you have to build your ability to see yourself as who you want to be seen as, right? Or to for yourself. It's not even about everybody else. It's about how do you see yourself and are you confident with who you are? I'm not going to say rejection doesn't hurt. It does hurt. But when we activate the soothe system, when we activate self-compassion, is to bring the idea that that rejection is not who you are.
I love
Does
that.
that
Yeah, that's great.
okay?
Thank you. We have another question here from Victoria. How do you manage clients who carry on shame or guilt from cultural or religious conditioning, which seems strongly tied to their value and parental expectations?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Um, I think we can't deny um, the cultural involvement in who they are, right? But it's also to understand meaning behind the interaction within that culture. Like if I think about the people that I worked with who have um, who they are is based on their culture. Where do like their shame is as a result of that interaction within the culture? Then it's understanding why I feel this way. Like what is the interpretation that they created? So it's not about you telling them, right? I don't tell them this is what happened. I ask them, well, why, like, what does it mean to you when you are experiencing this with your family member? And then to find that balance. So understanding that's how family is and that's not who you are, yet you're able to still work within that family system. Does that, I hope that answered the question.
It's really great. Angeline, I just wanted to take a moment to again thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and the wonderful story and all of your thoughts and expertise. Um, Thank you so much, everyone, for joining today's webinar. We have that webinar opt-in form for you to stay updated on all future webinars. We have lots and lots coming up this year, and we'll see you all next time. Thank you so much.